Hi, my name is Karen Anderson, and our website is called luminousself.com, and I'm glad you're here. Today I'm going to be talking about the challenges of incarnational patterns. What do I mean by incarnational patterns? Well, these are the patterns that come up repeatedly throughout our lives, and they're often the patterns, the challenges, the evolutionary doorways that we think we should be further along with. We may even think that we should be beyond them altogether. Why is this coming up? I thought I dealt with this. Or I've dealt with this a million times. And here it is again. What am I doing wrong? What am I missing? What am I not getting? And so we can watch how the mind can interface with our incarnational patterns in a way that ends up in judging, criticizing, comparing, wondering why other people don't seem to be as challenged as we are by this kind of stuff, and wondering if there's a way beyond it all that we just haven't found yet. Sometimes these incarnational patterns stem from other lifetimes altogether. We may know about this consciously, or we may sense that there's something going on here that feels bigger than just this lifetime. We may not be able to get our hands on exactly what it is, or we may have experienced during a past life regression or a spontaneous memory surfacing that, yes, this pattern does have much deeper roots and similar themes were coloring previous lifetimes. I'd like to tell you about one of my incarnational patterns, maybe the biggest one that I'm dealing with. And I'd like to use it as an example because it really demonstrates the way that life and the holo movement bring us the exact circumstances and conditions that are designed to help us transcend the pattern. At first, we may not get that about it, and it may seem like we're being punished or that the pattern is being intensified. But what I've seen in my own journey, and my story will illustrate this as you listen to it, is that over time, the fact that life is giving us the catalysts that we need to go beyond the pattern does result in bringing more and more awareness, more and more consciousness, and more of who we truly are in all the vastness of that to the pattern. So that over time, a way that's often very slow and subtle, we can look back and realize that we're no longer as caught by the pattern, we're no longer as identified with it, and we are beginning to experience life beyond it. So, my pattern goes back to my early childhood, as so many of these patterns do. So, I was a wanted child. I was my parents' first child. And when I was born, I was given a tremendous amount of love and attention and support so that I could learn and grow and become all that I was capable of becoming. I learned to read when I was 4 years old. I had lots of opportunities to explore life. My mom was very supportive in that way. My dad was off working, but when he came home, he was, from the very beginning, a source of absolutely unconditional love. And both my parents were very happy that I was in their lives. When I was 4 years old, my brother was born. And he turned out to be my only brother in this lifetime, which may have intensified the dynamic that was to unfold, because there were only the two of us and our parents. As my brother came into our family, my mother's attention naturally pivoted to be with this little newborn. And that began the process of what I saw later as dissociating from me and identifying with and really deeply bonding with this new little baby that had come into her world. And this went on especially for my mother. She was at that point home with us all the time and had not yet begun working out in the world. So I can remember, or maybe I was told, that at age 4, when this new little baby showed up in my life, I went over to his cradle and tried to dump him out of it. So obviously, the jealousy and the other emotions were already beginning to surface. But this wasn't really a major theme until a few years later, as my brother and I both were elementary school age. And I would come home from school and I would see my brother, who maybe had only gone to kindergarten for half the day, and my mother sitting at the dining room table, talking and laughing together about whatever it was that they were talking about. And I would come in from my day at school and I would look at the two of them, and they seemed to be so bonded and so together and so into each other that I just didn't feel there was a place for me at that table. And so I would say hi and I would go into my room and I would do whatever I did in my room. I'd do my homework if I had any. I'd read a book. I would do whatever I was doing. I was a very introverted girl and I did spend a lot of time reading. And so this pattern went on all throughout my childhood as I became an early teenager. I'd come in from school and there would be my brother and my mom sitting at the table, laughing and talking, having a wonderful time together. And I would go to my room and be my introverted self and feel that there was nobody for me to really connect with. My dad was a source of unconditional love, as I've mentioned, and that never changed. But his job required him to travel a lot. And so he was gone most of the work week. He'd be home on weekends, and we would always share a really nice connection. But then he would leave again. And so I felt all throughout my childhood this sense of loneliness, of sadness, of disappointment that I didn't have anybody to really deeply connect with. And it's interesting because, as so often is the case, our perceptions of what was going on don't always match what really was happening. And I found this to be true through a class that Barry and I took last year with someone who was teaching about recovering the inner child. And so as the class went on, Barry and I were both models for the man teaching the class because he was local. And so during my session with him, I went over to his house, I laid down on the massage table, and we went through the process that Bruce was teaching. And in that exploration of this early time in my life, I brought this exact incident to the process. And what I found through the etheric plane communication that Bruce was teaching us how to do, that my mom and my brother were not intentionally or deliberately excluding me. There was nothing malicious, nothing uncaring in what was going on. They just were so involved with each other, and they had such a natural rapport. They were born one day apart. They were both Sages, and my brother was born the day after my mom's birthday in early December. They just had such a natural connection with each other. They had so much in common. Their temperaments were a lot alike. They, they were just able to share a lot more easily than I was able to share with mom. And, I really saw during that process in the class that no, this wasn't something that was deliberately done to hurt me or to damage me or to leave me out, which was the story I'd been telling myself for decades. And so that was really revelatory. And since that class, we've begun to incorporate a lot of etheric plane communication in our own work with people, because people are often brought back to these early childhood moments when we did make certain conclusions and thought they were true about life and about how things had gone for us. So it's a really powerful technique, and we're so glad that we've learned more about it from Bruce. But, even though I saw that, even though that was a big revelation for me that they weren't deliberately leaving me out, it just was the way it went. It was kind of just a function of their level of connection versus my level of connection with them. It probably couldn't have been changed. Um, if I were a different sort of temperamental person, I might have sort of barged into that space and made myself a part of it, but that wasn't really my nature at all. And if anything, it tended to make me more introverted than I might have already been, because I just sort of concluded so early on that there wasn't a place for me literally at that table. So as I grew up, this pattern kind of receded into the background. I occasionally felt a little left out in social situations, especially because I was a quieter kind of person. And the louder, more boisterous, more confident, more extroverted people tended to take over in social situations. But there wasn't a huge charge around that. And I managed always to find friends and people that I could connect with just as who I was. I didn't have to try to be different to get them to notice me or want to be friends with me. It just sort of naturally happened. I even had a couple of really close relationships with men. I was married before I knew Barry. I was together with that person for several years and lived with a man before that for a couple of years. And so this dynamic was never a really big part of what was going on with either of those people. So it was just quietly waiting in the background for me to meet Barry. And little did I know when we met and when we began to realize that we were to be together, that this dynamic was going to surface. And it seemed like some kind of a cosmic setup because as I got to know Barry, I found out right away that his birthday was the exact same as my mother's birthday, and that his name was the same as my one brother. So I grew up as a part of Karen and Barry. And now, with this new relationship, I was back in Karen and Barry world again. And what began to happen was that I immediately could recognize that Barry knew a lot more than I did spiritually. He had a lot more information, he had a lot more learning, and definitely a lot more higher dimensional experiences. Beings on higher planes would come to him and communicate with him. And all of this was way beyond anything that I had experienced up until that point, and a lot of it still is. Barry's got a very different kind of personality makeup and energetic makeup. He's a lot more permeable and available to the higher dimensions. My energy tends to be a lot more grounded and stable in 3D. And although I've had higher experiences and they've been incredible blessings, they're not something that happens for me every day or multiple times a day, like I experience being in Barry's presence. So I immediately began to go into, is there something wrong with me? Here's this person who, again, like my brother when I was a kid, is outshining me in some ways. He seems more than I am. He seems better than I am. He seems more highly evolved than I am. And in that process of getting to know him, the inevitable comparing and judging and finding fault with began to enter the picture. Because if all of us still have remnants of ego, then we can be sure that some of those remnants are going to express through our spiritual egos, which can be even more ruthless than the regular old ego, because our spiritual journey is so important to all of us. it has so much weight in our consciousness, and we can be so sensitive about where we are in that process. It can be so easy to judge ourselves and find ourselves deficient because we're not as shiny, we're not as bright, we're not as illuminated, we're not as fascinating as these other people that we know who are having all kinds of experiences and amazing dreams and apparitions and all kinds of things like that. So that was one aspect of how the childhood pattern began to surface with Barry. And there was another, and it exactly replicated the dynamic my brother had with my mom, where she just thought he was everything. At one point, I remember we were visiting some relatives outside of New York City on Long Island. We were staying in their summer cottage, and I was lying awake at night in the bunk bed, and I was hearing the parents, the adults, talking in the next room. And I could hear my mom's voice saying, Karen's smart, but Barry's got the real brains in the family. And man, that was like a knife to my heart because all throughout my childhood, I think that I was attempting to win my mom's love by being good at school, by being the smart one, by being somebody who could at least succeed in that arena. And I'd work really hard. I'd always be doing my homework. I'd be doing extra credit reports and I'd be really into it. And there was a natural intelligence there. And there was a sense of being challenged by what was going on in school and liking that challenge and liking finding out that, yeah, I was pretty good at a lot of these things. It was fun to shine in that way, even though a big part of me tried to keep that secret from my friends. When we would get our tests back in school, I would always hide mine because I usually got one of the best grades in the class. I didn't want other people to know this. I didn't want them to feel bad about themselves. I didn't want them to call me the brain, which they did sometimes. I didn't want to be set aside in that way. As my introverted self, I just wanted to be kind of invisible and in the background. And when I stood out in that way, I felt really uncomfortable about it. So, looping back now to the other way that this childhood pattern of mine began to manifest in my connection with Barry was that occasionally we would come across people who, and usually they were women, I would say almost always they were women, um, who would hear Barry talking about spiritual topics, and they would realize how much he knew about all of this, and they would begin to put him up on a pedestal and do what I called swoon over him. And so I saw this periodically throughout our time together. We'd be working with people, and I'd see in the groups that, oh yeah, certain women were just hanging on Barry's every word, and they just thought that he was the wisest person they had ever met, and they were just so enamored of him. And of course, I was invisible alongside him. They weren't really seeing or paying attention to me, and it didn't seem that they had much of a place inside of them to value whatever I was bringing to the group situation. So that began to happen, and it got epitomized about a year or two ago when we were on a Zoom call with some friends that were living in different countries. This was a couple, and they were married, but they lived in different countries, and I'm not sure they ever lived in the same country the whole time they were together. I think they are still technically married, but still living on different parts of the planet. But here we are in this Zoom call. And the woman happens to be born a couple of days from Barry's birthday and right around the time of my mom's birthday and my brother's birthday. So the dynamic all got stimulated. And we're on this call, and this woman is focusing all her attention on Barry. Oh, Barry, you look so radiant. And Barry, let me tell you about this thing I have going on with my crystals. You'll know what to say about it. And oh, Barry, what are you noticing lately in your spiritual world? Not once did she ever direct even an eye gaze toward me. And of course, I began to go into my ancient pattern of invisibility and wondering, what am I doing here? What is this? Why is it repeating like this? It is so painful, and I'm so ready to be beyond it. And what do I need to get about this? So, of course, I didn't say anything during the call, although I'm hopeful that now I might have actually stepped into it more and pointed out what was happening and how uncomfortable I felt with it, that I wasn't able to be there in that way for myself at that time. I wasn't really ready or aware that I could even be my own advocate. And so I suffered in silence. And after that call, I chewed on what had happened there for weeks afterward, trying to get to the bottom of what I was feeling and what kept me silent, and how this was a complete replication of the childhood pattern and just so unacceptable to me to keep living with it. And so, where that whole incident eventually brought me was something that you're probably already guessing, that I needed to be much more present with myself. I needed to not abandon myself, not leave myself in the dust, because I was and am not a person that has this tremendously glamorous spiritual life, which this woman really idealized and had herself. And that I just needed to love myself the way I was. I needed to love myself as is, not when I'm going to get to a certain point spiritually, not when this happens or that happens, not when I'm beyond the patterns even, but how about right now? I need to be with myself right now. I need to see the beauty in who I am and how I am and the way that God made me right now. Not someday when I've evolved past some things that I think I should be beyond or that the spiritual ego thinks should be behind me, but right now. This is the only moment we have. And how long am I going to wait to include myself in the circle of my unconditional love? So I was able to see that this woman on the call was completely mirroring the part of me that ignores me, that downplays me, that thinks I'm not as good as Barry. I'm not as evolved as Barry. I'm not as spiritually aware as Barry. I really got to see that and get it on a deeper level. And that has pretty well stayed with me. Occasionally, women come along that get kind of swoony about Barry, and I can see it and I can point out when he gets swoony back, and that there's this whole sort of dynamic that happens that kind of echoes the dynamic I saw with my mom and brother. And I'm more at peace with it. I go into less of an emotional reaction with it. I don't feel as devastated by it as I've felt in the past. And I can see that every time the hula movement brings me back to another level of the spiral with this whole pattern, I'm at a different place. I'm less I'm less subjective about it, more able to stand back and witness it, to observe it, to see it. Oh yeah, there's that again. Right. Still another level of sadness and disappointment and pain and self-judgment, ready to be sloughed off. But okay, that will happen. We'll just keep moving with it. It's going to keep evolving, just like the rest of me. And I'm not stuck with it in the way that I used to feel I was stuck with it for many years. So I can see now, with decades of looking back over the pattern, that my big work and the reason that this pattern is in my life as a catalyst is to accept, to love, to care about myself. And if a situation doesn't feel good, extricate myself from it or say something, bring awareness to it, be bold enough and willing to be vulnerable enough to admit that this is painful for me, that I'm having trouble with it. that I'm not seeing myself. And I've been able to do that with Barry more and more over the last few years, especially. And he's been more able to see that pattern in me and to respond from a place of empathy and compassion rather than from a position of the teacher. And here's what you need to do with that, and here's how to go beyond it. So I've been receiving a lot more of what I always wanted to receive, even as a kid. Just that simple being seen, being loved, being cared about for myself exactly as I am in this moment. And I've been able to be that way much more with myself, which I think is the ultimate healing, isn't it? That we are there with ourselves, that we don't leave ourselves in the dust, that we don't have unrealistic expectations of ourselves, that we don't try to be or think that we should be more like someone else, which I went through a lot of years doing with Barry. Oh, if I were only more like him, people would see me too. And it just so happens that a lot of my role in life is a rather invisible one. You know, it's a deep feminine role of holding space for other people's process, which I love. It gives me a great deal of meaning. I don't need to be seen in that. And I'll have other videos, other audios where I talk about that as a very core part of why I'm here and things I was shown about that at very special moments in my journey. So it's basically about realizing that the divine Hola movement created me in exactly this configuration because that's what's perfect. That's what I'm meant to experience. It's what I'm meant to be and do and function as. And to accept that is a lifelong process, always going deeper, always coming up against places inside that don't totally accept it, that still think that something different should be going on, something flashier, something more noticeable, something more dramatic and incredible. And gradually, slowly, inch by inch, all of that is being transcended. All of that is being disidentified with. So the incarnational pattern doesn't run my life, but it's rather something that is kind of in the background and surfaces every so often when it's time to go to a new level of integration with it. And all of this more expanded awareness about the pattern has evolved through countless sessions with Barry and with myself over the years, over the decades that we've been together. So this has been a core part of the inner work that I've experienced with myself. And I guess that's where all of this brings me. I really want to extend the invitation to you that if you're grappling with an incarnational pattern that has a lot of suffering around it, like the one that I've described here, and if you feel that it would help to have a couple of other people hold space for you to dive into that pattern in a way that may not have happened so far, we are completely available for that. And you can work with both of us together, which I think is always very powerful. Or if it feels that you would like to work with one of us individually, that's fine too. You know, your inner being will show you and tell you what feels right to you. And we just encourage you to reach out because, as I've learned, you do not have to suffer in silence with this stuff. It can be so overwhelming that we don't think there's a way through it. It can seem so real that we can't really imagine life beyond it. But what I made this video for is to tell you that yes, there is a place beyond the pattern. And even though this pattern may still surface in smaller ways for me over the rest of my lifetime, that wouldn't surprise me. And I don't have a goal of, quote, being beyond it totally, because I don't even know if that's realistic. It can still be something that you revisit occasionally, but that colors your life way less than it did in the past. I think that's a realistic goal for all of us. And so I just invite you to be in touch if it feels that there's a purpose for us to connect around something like this that you're experiencing. Thanks for listening. I'd love to hear your comments. in the comments section below. Or if you feel you'd rather share more privately, please reach out with an email. It would be wonderful to connect with you, however you'd like to share what's happening with you. So I send you love and blessings and wish you well along your way, and know that we're all in this journey of awakening together. Lots of love. Bye for now.